Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us and welcome to the webinar today. My name is Carrie Berger and I'm with the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. I'll be the moderator for today's session, and to avoid any noise interference, I have muted your audio. So if you have a question, please type it into the chat box. Also to note that I'm recording today's webinar and it will be available for viewing and sharing by tomorrow, hopefully, on both our website, the Northwest Fire Science Consortium, and Landfire's website. And so first I'd like to introduce you to Jeannie Patton. She's TNC Landfire's Communications Specialist. Jeannie?
Hi, and welcome to the Landfire and the Northwest Fire Science Exchange webinar. I am Jeannie Patton, the communications lead for the Nature Conservancy's Landfire program, and this is one of a series of webinars we're offering this year in partnership with the Fire Science Exchange Network. They look at Landfire's Biophysical Settings Review project. Our webinars are recorded, and we post them on the YouTube channel. They're not on our website, but the links are on our website, but they will be on our YouTube channel, usually within a week. We announce all the Landfire webinars via our bulletin. It's bi-monthly. So if you do not subscribe yet, please do. The link to subscribe is on the last slide of this presentation. Today's presenter is Corey Blankenship, fire ecologist on the Nature Conservancy's Landfire Team. Corey joined TNC in 2005 when she was hired to facilitate the creation of thousands of vegetation dynamic models for systems across the U.S. Her undergraduate and graduate degrees are in geography, conferred by Western Washington University's Huxley College of the Environment. Corey's graduate research investigated seasonal changes in fire behavior and effects in the dry forests of north central Washington state. She's worked as a GIS specialist at the NWFireScience lab and as a wildland firefighter in Washington and Colorado for the Park Service and the Forest Service. Corey is one of the Conservancy's leads who is running the Biophysical Settings Review and Update, and she's going to walk you through that project this morning. Corey lives in Bend. Thanks, Corey. It's all yours.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Carrie, on my screen, I have it on my starting title slide. Is that what you're seeing?
That is what I'm seeing, Corey.
Okay, wonderful. Just wanted to make sure we're all in the same spot. Okay, well, good morning, and thanks for being here. I really appreciate all of you who called in, taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here. I am really excited to be here because the Northwest is home to me. I was born here, I grew up here, and with just a couple of exceptions, I did a couple of brief stints elsewhere, but other than that, I've lived my whole life either in Oregon or Washington. So this is a place that's near and dear to my heart, and I'm happy to be here this morning talking about the work that the Landfire program is doing here in the Northwest. Before we get started, I wanted to introduce you to the Nature Conservancy's Landfire Team. We are a partner on the Landfire program, so we work with the folks at the Missoula Fire Sciences Lab and the USGS Aeros Data Center. Those folks are primarily responsible for the mapping of the geospatial products that Landfire produces. The Nature Conservancy's Landfire Team is responsible for education and outreach on the project, as well as facilitating the development of the biophysical settings models that we're going to be talking about today. Here's a brief look at today's agenda. I'm going to start by giving just a 101 introduction to the biophysical settings models. Many people use on a daily basis and kind of understand the basics of geospatial data, but we find that not as many people are as familiar with state and transition modeling and the BpS models. So I'll make sure we're all on the same page there. And then we're going to look at some examples of using the biophysical settings models both within the Landfire program and by data consumers outside of the Landfire program. And then we'll wrap up by talking about the Biophysical Settings Review and the opportunity we have now to improve these models. All right, so I want to cut right to the chase here. I hope that today you will see that these models are extremely important, and that's because they help us to understand complex ecological processes and relationships. They focus on disturbance and succession dynamics across the landscape, and that makes them very valuable. They're also valuable in a management context because they provide this framework that allows us to look at the effectiveness of management actions. You can do things like scenario testing, analyzing the effects of alternative management approaches, and as I'll show in an example later today, looking at restoration opportunities. So hopefully you'll see this throughout the presentation today. And again, one more kind of ramp-up item before we get going. I want to look briefly at how Landfire fits into the Northwest context, because we are not the only data player in the game here in the Northwest. And in my experience, having worked across the country with the Landfire program, the Northwest is extremely data rich, not only in geospatial data, but also in terms of the kinds of state and transition models that are produced here that are also produced by Landfire. And so just a few examples here of folks who are using state and transition models. The ILAP, or Integrated Landscape Assessment Project, produced a bunch of models for the Northwest. The Forest Service Northwest Research Station has used models quite a bit in the past. The Forest Service Eastside Restoration Strategy is using them currently. These kinds of models were used in the Interior Columbia Basin Project, and that's just a few examples. So there's a real rich history here and a lot of state and transition modeling going on. And I think that despite all this great local data, there's still a role for Landfire to play here. The Landfire models are a slightly coarser resolution, both in terms of the geographic extent they cover and the detail in the model. And that makes them useful at broad scales. They also can be mapped because they don't have a ton of detail. The discrete classes within the models are still mappable, and they link well with the fire regime condition class methodology. Landfire models provide reference conditions, and not all other models in the Northwest do that. For example, the model set produced by ILAP was looking more at current conditions and management actions. Our models cover all lands, both forest and rangelands, and so that's something that is definitely unique to the Landfire program. And we link directly to spatial data products, and so there's this integrated relationship between the models and spatial data. So again, I just want to recognize that we're not the only player in the data business here, but what I hope to do today is just to provide some information about what Landfire has to offer, how that can be used, in what context it's appropriate, and then you all can make informed decisions about when and where to use these products, or when it's a better choice to use your local data sets. Okay, so let's just jump right in now to taking a look at what a biophysical settings model is. And to do that, I'm going to share a Music Ponderosa Pine model. Every Landfire biophysical settings model has two parts. There's a description that comes as a PDF or a Word document, and there's a quantitative state and transition model. And together those two things describe the basic ecology of the biophysical setting prior to Euro-American settlement. So these are reference condition models. I'm going to show you now what one of the descriptions looks like. So this is the first part of the model, the biophysical settings model description. And it's just in English, so this is very accessible. You don't need any special modeling software. Every description will start with a list of folks who contributed to the model. Let me see if I have a pointer here. Great. So you can see that here. And then you get descriptive information about things like the geographic range and the biophysical site. That will include information about soils and aspect and elevation. You also get a nice description of the vegetation and a table with common or indicator species for this biophysical setting. There's typically a very nice description of the disturbance regimes that are present for the biophysical setting. This one focuses largely on fire because in this dry forest, fire is the dominant disturbance, but you'll see, it mentions western pine beetle and mistletoe. It'll talk about any factors in the disturbance regime that are important for the particular biophysical setting. As you scroll down through the description, you can see that there's information on fire frequency. So here you see that this particular biophysical setting has an overall fire return interval of 6 years. And then the next major section, there's some information about mapping here, but I'm going to skip to the next, back one, major section, which is about the succession classes. This is the part of the description that links most closely to the state and transition model, and you'll understand it better when I show you the state and transition model next. But essentially what you're looking at here is a description of the development stages or serial stages for a particular biophysical setting. So in this case, we have this class A, which is described as an early development phase. There are particular structural characteristics that are associated with that. There are some indicator species. And then you get a description, a short description of what that is like. And you can see there are several other classes for this particular biophysical setting. And I'll go into more detail on those when we look at the model itself. And the last part is a set of references where you can get more information or the information that was used to build this particular description and the associated model. So that's what we mean when we talk about the biophysical settings description. And now we'll look more closely at the state and transition model itself. Okay, so this is a graphic representation of the serial stages in this particular model. You can see it starts with this post-disturbance phase, and then there is a mid and a late open class, and a mid and a late closed class. So this hopefully gives you some context for what these classes might look like on the ground. And the other thing is, because this is defined by open and closed states, I'm going to go back to the description and show you what exactly that means. What does it mean exactly to be open or closed? And that's where you have to go back to the description document to get that information. So remember, we said that there's structural information associated with each class. And here you see in the late open, the cover, canopy cover, is 10 to 40%. And in the late closed, it's 40 to 80%. So the distinction here between the open and the closed states is that 40% cover. If you're less than 40%, you're open. If you're greater than 40%, we consider that the closed state. So as you can see, there's the description goes hand in hand with the model. And then here's what the model looks like in the modeling software program. Right now, we use a program called STSIM. These models were originally developed in something called the Vegetation Dynamics Development Tool, or VDDT. And STSIM is just a newer version of VDDT. It has all the same functionality plus a lot of additional functionality. And so if you have VDDT models, you can bring them into STSIM and do the same kinds of things here, plus a lot of additional things. Okay, so here you're seeing those same 5 classes, but there's a little bit more information. Each class has an age range associated with it. So the early class goes from 0 to 19 years, and then your mid from 20 to 124, and so on. Then we define successional pathways between each class. So in the dry forest, the dominant pathway is going to be the open pathway, where the early goes to the mid-open and then succeeds to the late open. But there's also a closed pathway here. And that happens in the absence of fire. So here we're looking at, in green, the dominant successional pathways, and in blue, what we call the alternative succession pathways, and these are modeled probabilistically. And so there's a probability that if you're in the early all, if you go 18 years without fire, you'll succeed to the mid-1 closed state instead of following the open pathway. But if you make it to the mid-open, again, if you miss too much fire, you're going to close into the mid-closed. And it's the same in the late. If you go 20 years without fire, in late 1 open, you'll transition to the late 1 closed state. Okay, and then we also model the disturbance pathways. And here you're seeing arrows, lines and arrows for all of the fire pathways, but I've only put numbers, the fire return interval numbers, on the most frequent pathways, just because it got really cluttered when I added them all in. So we model surface, mixed, and replacement fire separately. You can see here that the surface fire is really driving the system, with frequent fires maintaining your open states, and also mixed fire maintaining those states or opening closed states. This model also has insects and disease modeled in it, and you can see those probabilities here. In general, insects and disease are used either to maintain states or to open the closed states up to an open state. Landfire will model any disturbance that's important to an ecosystem. So this model just includes the fire and the insects and disease. But we've modeled everything from hurricanes in the southeast to prairie dog disturbance in some of the Great Plains models. So anything that's important will be included. And then what we do is, after we've built the model and we have all of our succession and our disturbance probabilities in the model, we run it out for a 1,000-year time period, and we average the condition or the proportion of the landscape in each of the sterile stages over time. So what you see in this model is the typical, kind of dry western forest story, where historically most of the landscape is going to be either in your mid or your late open stages, and you get far less in your late and your mid closed. So this is a reference condition then that we can compare to the current condition and measure departure. We also use results for the fire frequency in the model. And you can see the fire frequency results for this particular Music ponderosa pine model here. I know you can't read the graphs exactly, and that's okay. They're kind of small, but I wanted to add them anyway so that you could see that there's variability over time in the fire frequency, and that's because the model is stochastic, so there is some variation. And we use these results then to map fire information across the landscape, and I'll show that in more detail in a later slide. Okay, now let's look at how we created these models. I really enjoy talking about the model set because it's unique in the sense that it's not just a product that Landfire makes and puts out there. This product was developed by hundreds of experts around the country, and it represents their collective ecological knowledge. So it's pretty special in that respect. Like any data set, these models have strengths and limitations. One of their great strengths is that we have models for about 500 different biophysical settings. Some biophysical settings that are widely spread across different regions will have more than one model associated with them. So, for example, ponderosa pine here in Oregon and Washington has a different model than the ponderosa pine in the Southwest. These data, or the models themselves, are connected to spatial data, and that's extremely powerful. So you can link each model to a spot on the ground. You can actually link each sterile stage within the model to a spot where it's found on the ground today. And so that can be very powerful for certain types of analyses. The data are relatively easy to use. I would argue they're relatively easy to use. And even if you don't buy that they're pretty easy to use, at the very least, they're supported by Landfire. And so if you go to our website, you can get tutorials and guides to walk you through some of the basic functions for using these models. And we have good documentation to accompany the model. So we're not just delivering a software file with a set of numbers in it and nothing to go with that. You really can't understand the numeric information in the state and transition model unless you have that description document. And what that document does for you is it gives you a whole lot of background information about the biophysical setting, but it also will do things like state some of the assumptions that go into the model or where the information came from. It'll explain some of the numbers that are in the model. And that is all really critical information for users to evaluate the model and decide whether it's useful for them or if they need to make some changes to make it better represent their local area. And the models are suitable for large landscapes. So it fills this role for broad-scale data across regions. Now, the models, of course, have some limitations. One thing is that they don't include any management or climate change information. When you get them off of the shelf, they're just the reference condition model. However, if you want to add that information in, you can, and a lot of people who use Landfire models will do just that. They'll take the reference condition model, they'll add in their management transitions, they'll add in some climate variability, maybe a time series, and they'll use that to run the models. We had a number of constraints when we put these models together, and that was because we were working all across the nation. So we really had to have some kind of basic sideboards to get these things developed and to make them comparable across a really vast area and very disparate geography. One of the major constraints or limitations that we imposed on the modelers who helped us create these models is that they could only use 5 classes to describe the biophysical setting. So only 5 serial stages were allowed. And in the Northwest, a lot of the local models will have much more than 5 boxes, so they go into greater detail. But one of the advantages of having those 5 boxes, and one of the reasons that Landfire did that, is because we wanted each stage to be mappable. And it's really difficult to map, sometimes even 5 classes, but more than 5 classes can get extremely difficult using the kind of Landsat imagery that our mapping is based on. Landfire models are also non-spatial. So one advantage to that is that I think they're a little easier to use because of that. It takes a little bit less sort of modeling expertise to use them. And there are fewer data requirements to run the models. But of course, some ecological processes are inherently spatial, and to answer some questions, you're really going to need spatial data. So Landfire, just off-the-shelf models won't provide that. But STSIM, the modeling framework that we're using now, can be run in a spatially explicit mode. So there is that functionality there if you want it. Landfire models, like any reference condition model, can be difficult to validate. The biophysical setting concept itself, there's very little historical data that we can use to validate these models. There is limited fire history information, even more limited for non-fire disturbances. Sometimes you get things like general land office data that you might be able to use, but all those data sets have their own limitations as well. And so in general, for most biophysical settings, there is limited information and they can be difficult to validate. And then not really a limitation, but the final item to note here is that these models can be refined for local use. Okay, this is a very complex diagram, but my point is that Landfire uses these models in a number of important ways. So here on the left, you are seeing the biophysical settings model. You have your state and transition model and your description document. And then on the right side of the page, you're seeing the mapped products that are in some way derived from information in the biophysical settings model. So, for example, the structure information from that model description is used directly to map succession class. The class percent that we get when we run the model out over time and we look at the proportion of the landscape in each of the successional stages, we use that, we compare it to the current S-class percent that we calculate from the succession class map, and we use that information to calculate departure, and that's how we get our veg departure product. We also link the biophysical settings information to the fire information. So the mean fire return interval from the model gets linked to the biophysical setting, and then we map from that the mean fire return interval across the landscape. The fire severity information from the model is linked to the biophysical settings and used to map replacement mixed and low severity fire. And then those two things together, your mean fire return interval and your fire severity information, are classified into the fire regime groups. So the quality of all these spatial products really depends on the quality of the information that comes out of that biophysical settings model itself. Now, just to take a step back, I want to talk about just conceptually why the information in the biophysical settings model can be important. This is a graph that I recreated from a chapter in a Weens et al. Book about the historical range of variability, and the chapter in particular was by Hugh Safford and others. And they have this great, really elegant description, I think, or figure, of how the historical information can be put into the context of the current and the future range of variability to make important management decisions. So here you're seeing on the y-axis the range of variation, and across the x-axis some different management type of scenarios. The gray bar is your historic range of variability for a given biophysical setting. The black is your current range of conditions, and the white bar represents the potential future range of variability that you expect for the particular ecosystem. So if all of these ranges overlap, you might be in a situation where you want to maintain the current conditions. However, if you get a situation that looks like this second one, where the historic and the historic and the future range of variability overlap, but they're not aligned with the current range of variability, you could be in a restoration type situation. This third example is where the historic and the current range overlap, but they're quite different than the future range of variability. And that's a scenario where you might want to look at some adaptation strategies. If the historic is definitely different than your current and what you expect from the future, you may want to look at some maintain rather than restore scenarios, because you may never be going back to this historical range of variability. And then finally, there's this restore then adapt scenario where the historic range of variability is closer to your future expected range than what you have on the landscape today. So I think this helps put the reference condition information into context. I definitely do not want to suggest that your historic condition is your desired future condition, but I think it provides this context that is useful when it's evaluated within the context of your current and your expected future conditions. Now let's take a look at a real-world application of these data right here in the Northwest. And many of you may be familiar with this particular study. It's by Haugo and others, Ryan Haugo, and it looks at restoration needs across Oregon and Washington. I think last year Ryan gave a webinar on this study to the Northwest Consortium, so some of you may have seen that. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I'm going to show how Landfire data were used with some of the local data sets to complete this analysis. This study demonstrated a new approach for evaluating where, how much, and what types of restoration are needed to move the present day forest structure towards the natural range of variability in Washington and Oregon forests. And so they use a number of different data sets, and there are three really foundational data sets that they needed to do this analysis. first they needed a map of biophysical settings, and they got that from the ILAP PVT map. Then they needed a map of current conditions, or what we call S-class or succession class. So where are the different classes on the landscape today? And to do that, they use the gradient nearest neighbor or GNN imputation data set. And then they needed some kind of a benchmark or a reference condition, and that came from the Landfire models. And so here in this diagram, you're seeing just a graphic representation along the x-axis of the successional classes within a dry Douglas fir biophysical setting. And the dotted line is showing your mean reference condition. This comes right out of the Landfire model. We then reran the Landfire models to get the range of variability around that mean, and that's represented by the green box. So we calculated the stochastic variability in the model to get the range of variation. And then the blue bar shows the current condition for each S-class, how much of the landscape is in each particular state today. And then with that information, they're able to look at where are there deficits or excess of certain S-classes or succession classes on the landscape. So one large area of excess is the mid-close. So in this dry Douglas fir, there's much more mid-close on the landscape today than we would have expected under the natural range of variability. There's also a big deficit in your late open class. And so they're able here to compare the current versus the reference condition. And then the next step was to quantify how many acres they needed to transition to another class to restore this particular ecosystem and what kinds of treatments they would need to do that. And I'll just briefly show some of the results. This map shows what they're calling the disturbance restoration needs. And this is where some type of active treatment would be done. So you might do thinning, you might do thin plus fire, or you might do some thinning and then allow for growth to happen. And so you can see very nicely from this map a couple areas really pop out where there's a high need for some type of disturbance restoration. The Okanagan shows up, as well as central and southwest Oregon as being areas in high need of some type of disturbance restoration. Now, not all areas need some type of disturbance restoration, or disturbance alone is not enough to restore forests. And so this graphic shows where there's some type of succession restoration need. And in general, that's just going to be areas that need to grow. For example, if you're lacking your late states, there's not really a way to make a late state from a mid or an early state. You just need to give it time to grow. And here again, we're seeing that the succession restoration need is high generally in those same areas as before, but some slightly different watersheds are popping up within those regions. And of course, along the Cascade Crest, there's much less need for restoration. So this kind of consistent approach for assessing restoration need is really made possible by both the great local data sets that you guys have here in the Northwest, as well as some complementary products from Landfire, and specifically those biophysical settings models. The reason that the models were used here is because it was the only set of models that covered all of the ecosystems that they were interested in and provided reference conditions for those systems. And they were mappable. The succession classes within them were mappable. And so all those things made the models a good choice. Okay, now, if you want to use the model set, we have a lot of great information online to help you get started. So you can go to landfire.gov, which is the mothership, and get some good information there. And from that, you can link to the Landfire Conservation Gateway website, and Jeannie's also going to give a link to this at the end. And we have a whole section called Support. And in that, you can get in-depth guides on certain common tasks that people want to do, and specifically, there's a set of biophysical settings models tutorials that help people get started on using the models. And so this information is available anytime for free online, and you can also contact the Nature Conservancy's Landfire Team. As I stated at the beginning, our role is to help people use the data, and you'll find our contact information on the website. Okay, so that brings us to the biophysical settings review. These models have had no review or refinement since we delivered them several years ago. And since that time, we know that there's new research and data out there that could be brought into the models. And there's some errors and inconsistencies in the model set that we would like to correct. And so we are asking people to help us review and improve this product. And just like we did when we built the models, we're asking the user community to help. Landfire does not have the knowledge and expertise. Really, the only way to build this kind of data set is to go out to the ecologists and managers across the nation that really know these ecosystems on the ground and to get their information. So to facilitate this process, we've created this website, landfirereview.org, and we're asking for people to go there, to download a description document for a particular biophysical setting of interest, to turn on track changes, and give us feedback. Now, because we thought that it might be a barrier if we asked people to go into the state transition modeling software, we've put all the quantitative model information into the description itself. So you don't have to model. You can if you want, but you don't have to. All that's required here is the ability to use Microsoft Word. And when you've given your feedback, then you just submit it via email to us, and we will offer our most sincere thanks. And you can feel good about contributing to this product that's used to support land management across the country. Let me just give you a real quick tour. If I can do it here, share application of the website, so you'll have an idea of what we're talking about. This is landfirereview.org, and when you get to the website, you'll come to our home page, which makes a plea for folks to help us with this effort. And there's some background information on the About tab, but what I really want to show you here is on the Review tab. If you click on Review, you'll get a basic set of instructions. There's just 4 instructions for contributing to the review. We have a short video for you to watch. It's about 5 minutes. Then you get your description. Then you review it in a word processing program and send it back to us. And there's all sorts of additional information here as well. Okay, now I have to get back. Stop sharing. Okay. Okay, back in the PowerPoint. Okay, so that's landfirereview.org and how you can contribute to the biophysical settings model improvement effort. Now, I'd like to offer 3 good reasons why you should contribute to this review. And the first one is to multiply your impact. And what I mean by that is that you can translate your knowledge into these products that are used in all sorts of applied and research settings across the nation. So you may not use them yourself, but a lot of people, other people are using them, and we want them to be the best that they can be. The second one is that these models have been used in dozens of land management applications, and we want to make sure that we're providing the best available data to support these efforts. So if you have knowledge and information that can be added, it'll make for a better product in the end. And finally, fun, which I have here in quotes, because that, of course, depends on your definition of fun. But what I mean here is that a lot of us spend time doing things like going to meetings, doing webinars, email, And they're not exactly the ecology or the natural resource management that we got into the field to do. And so one of the things that's really cool about working on this part of the Landfire project is that it offers an opportunity to kind of get back to basics and think about ecology and disturbance and succession dynamics on the landscape. And for some of us, we don't get to do that very often. So in that sense, it could offer you a little bit of fun. We do have a deadline here. If you can submit review by the end of June, we will be able to incorporate your review into the next round of models that we deliver. We'll accept review after that. We'll accept review at any time. But if you can get it to us by June, it can get into the next round of products. And then it can contribute to better mapped products as well, because that information will be provided to the mapping teams to use in the succession class and the fire regime products that I showed earlier that are linked to the models. And that brings us back to the take-home messages. Landfire models are not perfect, and I'm going to be the first to admit that, but I think they're very useful. And they're useful because they focus on ecological processes. They tie to spatial data, and they cover all lands, forest and rangeland systems. And they also provide a framework for exploring some key management questions and actions. And I think, as you could see with the Haugo et al. Study, the Landfire data can complement local data and enable the type of broad-scale analysis that Ryan, Haugo, and others did. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeannie Patton again, who's going to talk about some of the online connections.
Hi, everybody. I'm back. And Corey's going to take this over again for Q&A, so this won't take very long. I apologize for writing my cue. It isn't really a cue. It's supposed to go to Carrie. We have backup systems. She's recording as well, so this will make it to our YouTube channel as well as the Northwest. So we're easy to reach, our online connections. The Landfire program home you may already be aware of, landfire.gov. Landfire has space on the Nature Conservancy's Conservation Gateway. Corey showed you a little bit of that. We are at nature.ly.landfire. We do have a Twitter feed, and we're on it regularly. Our YouTube channel is Landfire Video. We do send out a bi-monthly bulletin. Our next one is coming out in March. And we invite you to opt in to receive this directly in your email. We send out postcards as necessary, only with news. So if you opt in at this address, you'll be getting the bulletin straight to your email. And it's also available online through your browser. You can always reach us at landfire@tnc.org with questions, comments, and that is where you're going to submit the Landfire BpS review. So I'll just emphasize landfire@tnc.org right now. I went through these URLs pretty quickly. If you write to us, we're happy to supply them again. BPS review website, landfirereview.org. So Corey, let's go to the Q&A screen and you can take it back.
All right, great. So I think you can either type a question into the chat panel. I think everybody's muted, so I think you do need to type it into the chat panel, and Carrie, you can correct me if I'm wrong there. I think I may have forgotten to say that if you would like to help with the BPS review, but you're not quite sure how to get started, just go ahead and contact me, and you can see my contact information here. So I'll just be quiet for a minute and see if there are any questions.
I think folks also have the ability to raise their hand if they want, and I think if you go to the feedback button, there might be a way there to raise your hand. So if you're having trouble typing into the chat box, go ahead and try that option. and then once you've raised your hand, I can unmute your phone.
One of the strengths of the Landfire team is that we're spread out all across the country. So while we're waiting for some questions here, I'll just let you know that Jim Smith, who's the lead on our team, is based in Jacksonville, Florida. I'm in Bend, as we mentioned earlier. Randy is an ecologist on the team, and he's in Chicago, Illinois. Sarah is our spatial analyst, and she's in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Jeannie's in Boulder, and Tim, I believe, is in Michigan. And so we're spread out all across the country, and one of the strengths of that is that we have folks that are familiar with different regions in the country. So if you have questions about different areas, we try usually to direct folks to someone who's most familiar with that particular area. All right, well, I'm not, Carrie, I don't think I can see the hands, so I'm not seeing any questions in the chat.
Right, and I don't see any hands up, so if nobody has questions, then I wanted to say what a fantastic resource, Corey. Your presentation was great, full of a lot of good information. And just a reminder to folks that if you want to contribute to that review, like Corey said, to please get that in by the end of June is the most ideal. So thank you so much, Corey and Jeannie, for explaining the biophysical settings review. I think we all learned a lot today, and we really appreciate you coming on and giving this webinar.
Well, thanks to everyone for calling in. I really appreciate your time.
Fantastic. All right, thanks, folks.